Okay, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the art movements that developed as a consequence of World War I. World War I was a war unlike any other. It was the first truly modern war. Over 20 million dead. It started with a cavalry charge, which really was the technology of the previous century, and it ended with a massive artillery barrage. When the United States got in belatedly in 1917, the Third Army launched in its first barrage more shells than had been fired during the entirety of the American Civil War. That's how much larger it was. It caused the collapse of empires. 5 empires went in, and none of those came out, with the exception of the British Empire. But England and France remained very, very broken as well. And to cap it all off, it ended with a plague. Hey! Fantastic. The horrors of the war really can't be overstated. It was the invention of the machine gun, of tank warfare, of chemical warfare. Most of the war was spent in suffocating trenches. In many cases, the shells, when they hit these trenches, would explode, and the fuses on the shells ideally are supposed to blow up in air and spread shrapnel everywhere, but many of these would actually only blow up once they had embedded themselves in the ground, setting up a tidal wave of earth. And many of the people, when they found the bodies, they had earth in their lungs, which means they survived the shell but were buried alive and suffocated. It truly was a horrific war, and it touched everyone. The famous Lost Generation, as named by Gertrude Stein, came out of that war. Ernest Hemingway was an ambulance driver and was injured, and even the rich and famous were touched by it. Quentin Roosevelt was the son of Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt encouraged him to go to war. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, was involved in the Spanish-American War, which was a relatively brief war, and remembered war as fun and honor-building, but that's not the way this war turned out. In fact, towards the end of the war, John Singer Sargent was commissioned by the British government to paint a painting honoring the veterans of the war. And so in 1918, as the war was winding down, he actually got access to the front lines. And instead of seeing something that looked like a victorious victory, he saw the effects of people who were gassed, and he saw this line of men all blinded by mustard gas leading each other along. And this became the subject of the painting, and this caused a kind of controversy because it focused on the dead and the dying rather than on the triumph of the war. But that was the reality of the war. And then in the last year of the war, we had, of course, one of the first great pandemics in world history in the 20th century. And that would be the Spanish flu. So called because Spain, which wasn't involved in the war, was free to report the realities of the pandemic. And so people said, oh, well, it must have started in Spain. In reality, it actually started in the United States. It started in a barracks in the United States. It was a prime breeding ground for the pandemic. You had all these soldiers. They were packed in tightly together. One would give it to another, and then they would ship them on mass transit boats over to the to the theater of war, and they spread the disease like mad. So it really should be called the American flu. But American propaganda and American press suppressed it because they felt like it would lead to low morale, and that's the case. And more people actually died in the Spanish flu epidemic than died in the war. And many of the artists and writers and poets that we know actually died because of the Spanish flu epidemic. Apollinaire died in the war. I think Sheila died in the war. A whole ton of really incredible creative individuals. So what was the impact of all of this? Well, the impact was a kind of dissolution of society, that society really went into World War I absolutely confident in itself, had this incredible civilizational confidence. If you remember the Futurists were crazy national patriots, and they actually said that we glorify war, the Earth's only hygiene. Well, not so much after the war. Italy suffered at the war, not as much as France and Germany, of course, but that kind of reversed that idea. Men came back shattered. You can see in this painting by Otto Dix, you have people with prosthetic jaws and limbs playing cards with their feet because their arms are no longer there. There was a great deal of war trauma, what they called shell shock at the time, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. And this had an enormous impact on culture at large. People kind of gave up on God, king, and country, and all of those ideals. And so you have the French existentialists come out of this. In American writers, you have the Lost Generation. So you have writers like, again, Hemingway and Fitzgerald, etc., who write kind of nihilistic books. Nihilism, of course, is the belief that nothing really matters, that life goes on, but there really is no greater meaning to it. And there's a whole series of new art movements and philosophical movements that start because of this. In France, there was a kind of return to order, a return to normalcy. We saw that at the end of Cubism. Picasso gives up Cubism and goes to a kind of stylized neoclassicism, because it's like, what do? We have to remake the world. And, you know, we were a bunch of crazy kids when we were inventing this Cubism stuff, and now the world seems a little bit too crazy. We wanted to bring back order. Some of the other things that they did was social realism. Social realism grows out of the progressive movements in both America and Europe. And it was the feeling that, okay, art had been pretty much an avant-garde enterprise that had existed to create fun and crazy stuff. It was all about the style. It was radical. And the feeling was art could never be that way again, that art couldn't be neutral. If you want to know why, especially contemporary art, often has a very strong political activist pose, that's because of this era. When the whole world went to crap and seemed to be going down in flames, the art world was engaging in stuff that was kind of nonsense, and people look back on that and say, well, we can't do that anymore. We have to take a side. And so you see artists come in on one side of the issue or another. And interestingly enough, several of these groups are going to be hardcore Marxists or hardcore fascists. With the old world collapsed, people gravitated to the camps that said that they could rebring order. And one of those were, of course, Marxists, and the other ones, of course, were the fascists or the nationalists. It's kind of hard to think about it now, but back then, in the 1920s and 1930s, it really did look like the world was going. The Weimar Republic was collapsing. There was runaway inflation. In places in Germany, you had to have a wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks just to buy a loaf of bread. It was better to wallpaper your house with your money than to actually spend it because it was so worthless. And people were really suffering. And when you do get suffering in that way, you end up going towards extremes on the political spectrum, whether it's left or right. And I think you can kind of forgive people for that. Philip Johnson, famous American architectural critic and eventually architect, was actually a member of the Fascist Party, was a Nazi sympathizer, so were several American celebrities at the time, most famously Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was a part of the America First program, which was basically intended to keep us out of what was happening in Europe at the time, as there was this rise in conflict. On the other side, of course, were the Marxists. The Marxists and the communists now had Russia in the Bolshevik Revolution, and they were pushing towards change in that regard. And people sorted themselves out into, one of these two camps. Now, I do want to make a kind of, clarifying point here. When we talk about social realism, we're talking about artwork that is bringing attention to the social ills at the time. Works like Ketukovitz, who was doing posters like this, Never Again War. She had a son who died in the war and very much resented it, and was, a committed pacifist at that point. We got to make sure that we don't confuse this with socialist realism. Socialist realism was the official propaganda of the Soviet Union during the reign of Stalin. Stalin would make these pictures that were otherwise, kind of soft impressionistic pieces, but had, entirely patriotic content with these boys and young, kids looking up to Stalin, Papa Joe admiringly. Of course, Stalin was a horrible dictator and a massive tyrant, and utterly squelched the innovation and the avant-garde under his reign. So we're not talking about socialist realism. Socialist realism is different from social realism. Social realism instead often concerned itself with issues of death, and with scenes that tried to bring people's attention to the sufferings of the world. Ketukovitz was perhaps one of the most famous ones. She did a series of prints. Even before this, she was a progressive, but became increasingly more progressive after the war. She was responsible for creating this statue, which is a Pietà, which shows a victim of the war and the embrace of mothers. The same thing actually happened in America. You have artists like Philip Evergood, who was, painting pictures of the struggles between union, activists and Pinkertons and cops and corporations, and the struggles that were the social ills that were happening in America at the same time. Now, perhaps the person who falls into this camp is Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was, of course, one of the founders of the Mexican Muralist movement. I won't go into the Mexican Muralists too much. They're really fantastic, but you'll have to take my Latin American class if you want to listen a little bit more on them. But you see this in his works as well. He was very active in the United States, had done a series of murals for Henry Ford, and was very closely tied to a whole number of industrialists. It's funny, we think of communists and we think of the left and the progressive left as being pro-environment. But at this time, it was the conservatives who were kind of on the pro-environment side, and it was the leftists who were on the pro-industrial side. Because one of the arguments of Marx was that after we had seized the means of production, industry was going to be the way we were going to provide prosperity for all of the proletariat. So the communists were very pro-industry and very pro-technology, whereas now the roles have switched and changed. But there we are. And he was actually commissioned to create this painting for Rockefeller Square in New York. So Rockefeller, of course, one of the great oil families, one of the great, media families in the United States, wanted and commissioned him to do this for Rockefeller Square, and this one was called Man at the Crossroads. And this one was eventually destroyed. This is he did a redo of it for the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City. But it gives you a summation of the view of the universe at the time. On one side, you have the forces that represent the nationalist forces. Let me just go through here and highlight some of these things. You have nationalist forces with their war machines over here, and over here with their red flags, you have the proletariat. You kind of have the old gods. You can very much see that Christianity is seen as a part of the old order. Here you can actually see a statue with a fasces and a swastika representing fascism in the old order. And here you see the advance of technology come together. Man masters both the large and the small. You can see these lenses are reflecting gigantic spheres of interest, and we have astronomical subjects on one side and microscopic subjects on the other, and the whole world is bringing forth its bounty. And at the center of it is the new man, the working man, who is controlling it. And the hand that reaches forth holds a gauge, as you might see in a factory. All of the information here is about the triumph of man through science and technology and progress over the old order. You can see the decadent old order over here, drinking and sipping their champagne, and then the new order is represented by Lenin, who is presented unifying the hands of all races and people here. So Diego Rivera was a committed Marxist. It makes sense that he would do this, but if you're painting this for Rockefeller, one of the biggest capitalists in America, you could understand why this suddenly became a problem. Rockefeller insisted that the entire thing be stopped, and in fact, it was never completed. It was unfinished at the time that he painted it, and it was quickly covered over and then painted over. So it gives you a sense that Diego Rivera refused to change. You have to give him credit for his artistic integrity. This is one of the few pictures of the original version that we can see, and it is actually quite substantially changed from the one that wound up in Mexico City, but it does at least give you a sense of what his intent was. So Rockefeller had that covered, but Diego Rivera, you got to give him credit for his integrity. He wanted to bring to attention the problems of the world, and the solution as he saw it, and the solution as he saw it was Marxism. In Germany, there was some other reactions that were created. We had a new movement come about called the New Objectivity. The New Objectivity said, all of this sentimentalism, all of this abstraction, all of this emphasis on style or technique, Cubism was all just so much nonsense. It was just indulgence and decadence. And we have to show the world as it is. And so this grew out of a kind of disillusionment with what was happening before the war, and decided we needed to show the world as it is. And what they mean by that is that people had to see the reality of war, the viciousness of war. Max Beckmann, who was an expressionist who joined this, he said, "We must be a part of all the misery which is coming. We have to surrender our hearts and our nerves. It's the only course of action which might give purpose to our superfluous and selfish existence as artists, that we give people a picture of their fate." So New Objectivity was like, hey, we have to point out the ills of society. Unlike Social Realism, which was a little bit more optimistic and positive, was like moving people towards social change, New Objectivity was like, hey, this is the world we live in. It's kind of ugly. It still had this sense of activism. So you get Otto Dix. Otto Dix produced these really terrifying scenes of figures in war. And George Grosz was painting pictures that were making fun of society, and particularly of the kind of German society that led them into the crisis of war. This one is called Pillars of Society, and the pillars of society are the four aspects of society that George Grosz believed led to the catastrophe of the war. So on one side we have this man who is, by his dress, meant to represent the old aristocratic order, and you can see that on his mind is, cavalry charges and honor. He holds a sword. His veins are breaking in his face. He's obviously upset that Germany has lost the war. He has this nationalistic spirit. Over here you have a newspaper man, a journalist who is carrying his newspapers, and over the top of his head is a chamber pot. Then over here you have a businessman, and the businessman, his head is literally a pile of poop. It looks almost exactly like the poop emoji. It's so funny. And then you have a priest. A minister who is sitting here urging people onto war. And of course we see the destruction that results from this. And what he was saying is that almost every level of society, its aristocracy, its press, its business interests, even its religion, had failed them and led them into the disaster that was World War I. He has many such pictures. I love this one. This one is called The Eclipse of the Sun. And again, you don't need to look too hard into this to understand what's going on. Here you have a person representing the Kaiser. He's surrounded by men with no heads. These individuals, of course, are yes men. And then we have a donkey with blinders just eating out of this. A skeleton in the background. The powerful and the rich are whispering into his ears. He's controlled by his rage. And then, of course, we have the eclipse of the sun, and it's being eclipsed by money. So it shows the full corruption of society that existed. Beckmann's stuff is a little bit more nuanced. Beckmann wasn't as heavy-handed with stuff, but he tried to get into the full psychological terror of it. The Night, which is kind of a narrative scene without a specific narrative, relays the chaos and the fear that followed in Germany after World War I. We have clear scenes of what indicate rape and assault. We have men in uniforms coming in, torture, people being hung. It gives a sense of the anxieties of the age and the fears of the age. Well, into all of this anxiety comes perhaps one of the most daring and creative art movements ever conceived, and that's Dada. Dada actually starts in the middle of the war. By 1916, everybody could tell that the war was an absolute crapfest. Switzerland remained neutral, and many individuals from both Paris and elsewhere had retreated to Switzerland as a place to kind of continue the decadence of the previous era in the absence of war. And at a cabaret, the Cabaret Voltaire, which is interesting because Voltaire was one of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, and the absolute antithesis of Dada in many ways, you have Hugo Ball, who creates the Dadaist Manifesto. And it is a movement dedicated to nonsense. Dada as one of its founders, Francis Picabia, said, "It smells of nothing, it is nothing, nothing, nothing. It's just meaningless." The old story is that they wanted a movement that showed that art was absurd, that life and culture was absurd. You were going through the midst of this insane war, and in the process of going through this insane war, it was hard to say that any life could be meaningful. So how could you say art could be meaningful? So they often described Dadaist as an anti-art movement. And according to legend, the story goes, they pulled open a French dictionary and they stuck their finger in at random to find the title for their movement. And the word that it landed on was Dada, which was a slang word meaning rocking horse. And they figured, yep, that's pretty nonsensical, that's good. And that's how they picked it. Now, the one thing you do have to know about Dadaists is they're all pathological liars. Every single one of them lied. But of course, if you have an art movement based on nothingness and meaninglessness and the just nihilism of reality, then why should you expect them to tell the truth? There are reasons to think that they didn't pick that name by accident. Rocking horse is just too apt of a metaphor, because a rocking horse is something that you can get on and you can rock. It makes you feel like you're going somewhere and you're having fun, but of course you're going nowhere. It's futile action. It's, it's just for the sake of it. And so that was too apt a metaphor, I think. And so I question the authenticity of that story, as I question many of the stories that come out of Dada, because they all were notorious frauds and liars. It's like having an art movement with a bunch of Sacha Baron Cohens. They were all kind of merry pranksters. So this was the poster advertising the opening of the Cabaret Voltaire, and one of the first performances that came out of it was Hugo Ball himself. And he dressed himself up in this outfit, and in this outfit he had aluminized cardboard, this crazy hat, and he had gloves that looked like lobster claws. And he read this poem called Caruana. And Caruana was a collection of absolute nonsense, of complete nonsense words. This is one of the first ever pieces of performance art. And that's why it's so critical. That's why Dadaism is so critical, because Dadaism advances so many ideas in pop art and performance that will come later. It is the germ of so much of it. But just read some of this. Caruana, Jolalantu Bamblo Alfali Bambla, Grosignum Pampa Habla Horam, Digala Goramamam, Higo Blanco, Rasula Baju, Halaka Halala, Ungalabung, Blagobung, Blagobung, Baba Fataka. I mean, it just goes on. It's nonsense. It sounds like words, but of course it's meaningless. And Hugo Ball actually explained this piece. He wanted to suggest that, in the days in the run-up to World War I, there were a lot of theorists who had argued that, well, no such great war between the European powers was possible because they had all of these alliances. And, the Germans were allied with the Austro-Hungarians, the Russians were allied with the Serbians, the French were allied with the Belgians were allied with the English. So if anybody tried anything, it would be mass war, it would be mutually assured destruction, so nobody would dare try it. And plus we had all these negotiations, we had these family ties, many of the royal families of Europe were cousins and related with each other. So there was all this theory that, hey, none of this could ever possibly happen. Well, all it took was a single bullet in the back of the head of Archduke Ferdinand as he backed up into the sidewalk, and an anarchist popped him in the head, and every single one of those alliances tipped off. The Austro-Hungarians demanded that Serbia be annexed. Serbia reached out to Russia. Russia reached out to... that triggered Germany to come in on the side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then that triggered France to come in, and then the Germans went through Belgium, that triggered England to come in, and the whole thing went up. The only thing that people that kept out of it for any time were the Americans, but eventually the Americans, with the sinking of the Lusitania, actually came in 1917. So the words are nonsense, and that was the point, as he was saying, that all of these great words that were supposed to have kept us out of war or meant anything were ultimately nonsense. The world was nonsense, and they were committed to a movement of nonsense. Hans Arp created this collage, and according to again, I'm certain this is a lie because this is just too well organized, but this is squares arranged according to the laws of chance. He stood up on a ladder and lowered he just dropped these squares onto a piece of cardboard below him, and wherever they laid, that's where he glued them down. Do you honestly believe that this happened by chance? I tell you, no. But the idea itself, the idea of squares arranged by the laws of chance, that life and art is somehow meaningless, that's just as meaningful a way of making art as any other. You can see this in the wonderful works of the collage. There's a lot of collage and references to pop culture. This is cut with the Dada kitchen knife through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epic in Germany by Hannah Husch. And it's a fabulous work. It combines text, and I love how it says both Dada and anti-Dada and join Dada. It has a series of images. It has the Kaiser himself, who was seen as the individual who brought them all together. It has the face of many of the players. It even has the face of Ketukovitz, who was brought in as one of the first female art professors at the time and got an appointment with the state as a female art professor. But it also shows scenes from popular culture, dance. Notice that it has an emphasis on machines. Machines were supposed to bring us all of this prosperity, and yet what did the machines do? They unleashed the war machine. It's a real indictment of the emptiness of German society and the promises of modern society and how ultimately they failed. So you can see this in the works of these artists, but none of these artists probably push it nearly so far as Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp was a French artist, and he had already had some experience in the United States because he had exhibited in the Armory Show. He was painting in a kind of Cubo-futurist style, but he comes to America and starts hanging out with Alfred Stieglitz and his crowd. Remember them from the photo secession? And it's interesting that the Americans were all wanting to go to Europe. They wanted to see, the exciting things that were happening in Paris and Berlin, and Marcel Duchamp and Francis Picabia was like, why do you want to go there? New York is where it's happening. And so Marcel Duchamp becomes this merry trickster, this prankster that exists to poke holes in the world of art. And he ends up becoming one of the greatest artists of the 20th century, at least in terms of how he changes the world of art. And he had a number of pseudonyms and false identities that he used to put on. This one is the very famous Eros Salavi. Of course, Eros Salavi is a pun. In French, it means, to love, c'est la vie, that is life. And of course, here he is dressed up as a woman. He was fascinated by machines, and a lot of Dadaists were fascinated by printed materials and machines that were appearing in catalogs. Now, we live in the age of Amazon, but this was the age of Sears and Roebuck, where catalogs and mail orders were available, and so there were print advertisements for things everywhere. And he saw this in a front window shop and an advertisement, not the actual object, and decided to paint it. So he made a painting of a mechanical object. This is a chocolate grinder. Chocolate was very popular in France at the time, but you had to grind up the chocolate nibs, and so you needed a device for doing this. So this is a common household item, an appliance that would have been made. And they loved things that were wheels or mechanics because they turned, and the turning gave a sense of repetitive motion. Again, it's like the idea of the rocking horse. You can rock on it and it feels like you're doing something, but you're going nowhere. And so the repetitive motion here was very, very kind of appealing to him. And so he just copied the advertisement. He rendered it out in paint, but he copied the advertisement. So lifting something directly from printed material and reproducing it, collage, or copying, that became a way of taking the existing consumer culture and reappropriating it, recontextualizing it to attack that same culture. There's also a very fun pun here, a kind of euphemism. In France at the time, the euphemism to grind one's own chocolate was a euphemism for something that we seem to have an endless series of euphemisms for. Choking the chicken, spanking the monkey. So I hope I don't have to spell that out for you. But basically, I will spell it out for you because it's masturbation. Masturbation has an endless series of euphemisms across cultures. And in France this time, to grind one's chocolate was this euphemism for masturbation. So why on earth is he making this icon, this emblem of masturbation? He's arguing that art itself is a kind of masturbation. You know, the whole point of masturbation is it gives you sexual satisfaction, but it doesn't produce anything. I'm gonna get totally flagged on YouTube. I'm gonna get, you know, if I had these monetized, I would be concerned, but I don't. I'm gonna get flagged. But the idea being that, you know, okay, so you do this for your sexual satisfaction, but it's completely non-creative. Nothing comes out of it. It is the opposite of procreation. You know, sex with a partner at least has the possibility of creating a child and of being productive in that regard. And what he's saying is art is the same thing. That we think that art is creative, but it's not. It's masturbatory. You haven't created anything. You've entertained yourself, but there's nothing truly genuine that comes out of it. We can see similar ideas in the works of Francis Picabia. Francis Picabia would make these paintings based, again, lifted directly off of printed material. Now, sometimes he would modify them, but they look almost exactly like straight-up copies out of catalogs. This one is one of my favorites. This one is Portrait of a Young American Girl in a State of Nudity. Okay, so what is it? It's a spark plug. And what's the purpose of a spark plug? It sparks off the mixture of fuel and air in an engine, in a combustion engine. Of course, combustion engines were brand new technology at the time, and that causes it to go. It, you know, gives it the thrust that it needs. And calling this a young American woman in a state of nudity, what does that mean? And what he's doing, again, he's taking something and he's using a sexual metaphor. Of course, if you see a young American woman in a state of nudity, that would be sexually stimulating, at least to people who are into that kind of thing. And so the whole point is that it's an automatic process. You respond automatically. There's no free will, and there's nothing really significant about it. It is as mechanical and as simple as a spark plug. You put the juice to a spark plug, it sparks. That's all it is. That's kind of dehumanizing in a way. It says all of human activity, even sexual activity, is kind of just pointless. It's at this time that Marcel Duchamp starts having his real first experiments with what would be called ready-mades. To him, a ready-made was an object that already existed, and he would merely take it and recontextualize it. The first one that we know of is this. This is a bottle rack. Now, all those little, hooks there are things that you would stick wine bottles on. You would reuse wine bottles, you'd sanitize them, clean them, and then you'd have to dry them, and so they'd be dried on this rack. And he just took this rack and just placed it in the context of a work of art, and just called it a work of art. The next one he did was In Advance of a Broken Arm, which of course is a snow shovel. Again, it's an ordinary snow shovel. There's nothing been done to it. He simply takes it and sets it in the context of a gallery, gives it a new title, and that makes it art. I think to understand this, you kind of have to look at one of his more famous examples, and that would be the bicycle wheel. The idea is that art is something that is inherently useless. So the definition of art is its lack of utility. So what he would do is he would take a stool, which was useful, and a bicycle wheel, which was useful, and he would combine the two together so that you couldn't sit on the stool or you couldn't use the wheel, rendering them both useless. And therefore, they become art. See the logic of this? I know it sounds crazy, but that's the idea. They're making this comment about art, taking an existing object and rendering it useless, and because art is useless. The most famous example of this, however, is Fountain. So Fountain becomes one of the most controversial works of art in the history of modern art, but it's also a seminal moment as well. So the Society of Independent Artists in America decided that they were going to hold an exhibition, and they were going to be very radical, very progressive about it, and they decided that the exhibition was going to have no juried entries. Typically, when you submit something to an exhibition, you submit it, it goes through a jury, that is a selection of artists or critics who will jury and, like a jury, vote and judge each piece, and some will be rejected and some will be accepted. But they decided that it had become so thorny, the jury itself had become this filter, this arbitrary filter. They decided that they would have no jury, that anything that was submitted to the show would be accepted. Now, on the board of the Society of Independent Artists of the time was Marcel Duchamp. And Marcel Duchamp decided to really test if they were serious about this. He was really going to push this to the limit. And so he and a few of his friends got together and they put together what we might call, a prank or a troll. He went down to a standard plumbing supply and he got a urinal. He again created another fake identity, this time R. Mutt, and he signed the urinal and laid it on its side and titled it A Fountain. Of course, that's just hilarious because a urinal is something that receives waste. A fountain is something that gives forth water or inspiration, and nobody wants to be drinking out of this. And so the work of art was submitted, and initially they were really embarrassed by it, but they were all in on the kind of con, and so he actually got friends to, kind of make a case for it and insist on its inclusion, to go down and say, well, where is this wonderful piece by R. Mutt? He even actually wrote, as Marcel Duchamp, a defense of this piece. So he made a defense of this piece. And of course it caused an enormous scandal, but he was trying to hold them to their own standards. Hey, you're the one that said anything was going to be accepted, and it turns out you didn't really mean that. When the whole thing was over, the original piece was thrown away. We don't even have the original piece. What you're looking at here is an authorized reproduction in the Tate collection. We only have a couple of photos of the original. This one is an original photo by Stieglitz of it, and you can see that they actually had to handcraft. Okay, so this thing is a handcrafted reproduction of a urinal. That's just hilarious. So here, for example, is the Tate authorized reproduction, and here is the first authorized replica. So this thing quickly passed out of public consciousness at the time, but years later, people looked back at it and they realized that this was probably the first ever piece of truly conceptual art. The first piece that ever demonstrated that, art is fundamentally what we say it is. And if you're offended by this, congratulations, you get it. You're supposed to be offended about it. Marcel Duchamp was a Dadaist, and he was arguing that art was fundamentally meaningless. And you may think this is crazy, but what better way to make that point? So if you think this is ridiculous and a joke, congratulations, you get it. That was the intent. The intent was to deconstruct art entirely. And you may say, okay, well, why does he have to do this? Well, if somebody comes by and just tells you art is meaningless, grabs you by the lapels and say, oh, all art is meaningless, you're like, yes, crazy person, let me get on the subway, I have work to do. You wouldn't listen to it. But when you attach it to an object, then it becomes something more. It externalizes that view, and it becomes a work of art. So years later, people realized that this was a seminal moment in the history of art, and that this was the first time anyone had deconstructed the meaning of art. Even people like the suprematists who were painting black squares, who had deconstructed every aspect of the Academy, still fundamentally believed in meaning. That even though you were painting these non-objective black squares, there was still deep meaning there. And this just blows that out. It says, no, art is meaningless. And it's all just in your head, and it's otherwise garbage. So as the years went on, Marcel Duchamp more or less retired from art, and then he went into chess. If you are an aficionado of chess, there's several famous chess moves that are pioneered by Marcel Duchamp. He was just a genius-level intellect and went on to do several other things. And one of the things he did is in the 1940s, he made this little case, this little valise that had little miniature versions of all his greatest hits. It's really kind of hilarious. It's his entire portfolio in a box, but he rendered them all as tiny little miniatures. And you'll notice there is the little urinal right there. He actually included it. So, what a funny thing. And so in the 1940s, people said, yeah, I remember that. And it really became, this important moment. So in the year 1950, a French art critic said, well, you need to make a reproduction of this toilet. It was this important work of art. The original was thrown away. He didn't care about it. It was a joke. Marcel Duchamp said once famously, he lived long enough to see the Dadaists collected in museums. And he said, Dada was a bomb. It was supposed to blow up the art world. So could you imagine someone going to a cafe that had been blown up by a terrorist bombing and collecting the pieces of the bomb and putting it in a museum? No, you'd never think of that. But it quite amused him that he lived long enough to see Dadaism collected and revered for that reason. And so a French art critic came to him and said, well, you need to make a reproduction. And he says, no, I'm not going to make a reproduction of a urinal. Give me a break. And so the French art critic said, well, if I get you a urinal, will you sign it? And he said, sure. So this guy went to a secondhand store, found a used urinal, and brought it to Marcel Duchamp. And Marcel Duchamp said, brilliant. And he signed it. And so this is the one that happened in 1950. This is the one right here that was the first authorized reproduction. And this one is currently in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And then years later, people said, oh, we got to have more. So he authorized 4 additional reproductions that were handmade reproductions, and those are spread around collections of the world, and that's these. Now, for my opinion, when you have to make a toilet to replicate a toilet that was now lost, that really doesn't have the spirit of it. The kind of spontaneity, the fact that it was a used toilet. To me, this is the only original Duchamp, even though it's not. It's kind of an authorized reproduction. And this one wound up in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The Philadelphia Museum of Art has a gallery dedicated to Marcel Duchamp. It's one of the greatest galleries on Marcel Duchamp. He had a very special relationship with the museum. As I said, he more or less retired from art in the 1930s and went and did other things. And it wasn't until the end of his life that he gave his last, most famous work of art to the Philadelphia Museum as an installation. So if you want to go see Marcel Duchamp stuff, you got to go to the Philadelphia Museum. It's fantastic. What's interesting is I actually know a little bit of the story about how this thing got into the Philadelphia collection. Marcel Duchamp in the 1960s, by the 1960s, everybody recognized him as this seminal figure in both conceptual art and also performance and other areas. And the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I think Duchamp died in 1964, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art had many of his greatest works, but they didn't have this one. And so they wanted to purchase this one for the collection. And the price at the time was $2 million. I think this was the early 70s. So they had to go to their donors. They had to go to the patrons of the museum, the people who donate money to fund the museum, to tell them, we want to buy a urinal for $2 million. Now, the curator who told me this story said that at the time, every city in America has its own unique character. For example, Boston sees itself as very intellectual. It's the home of Harvard and MIT, etc. They're both nearby. And so if you'd have sold them as there was this rare piece of intellectual, kind of conceptualism, they would have bought it and they would have supported it. New York sees itself as hip. It sees itself as avant-garde. If you would have told them that this was the, piece of avant-garde, they'd have bought it like that. But Philadelphia is an old money town. Philadelphia is a very conservative town. The big money is all Quaker money. Very, very conservative town. and it prides itself on its history. And so here they were trying to convince all of these donors and patrons of the museum that they had to shell up $2 million to buy a urinal, and they weren't buying it. They weren't, nope, we're not going to do it. Finally, somebody said, look, I don't care if you hate this thing. I don't care if you think this is absolutely ludicrous. This object is the first time in history that someone did something like this, that they put up a ready-made and basically declared that art has no meaning and just said that it's art because I put my name on it. And that's the first time in history that's ever happened. And you cannot let a work of art historical significance like that go to a collection in New York or Boston. Philadelphia prides itself on its history. It's, of course, where the Declaration of Independence was written and signed. It's where the Constitution was written and signed. And so they said, okay. And they bought it. And it's in the gallery today. So think about the multi-layers of this, that we have a fake reproduced urinal representing the original urinal. Duchamp must have loved it. He must have absolutely loved it. But it shows how much things had changed and how things had really fundamentally, changed under Dadaism. And it's not just in one area. Man Ray was a photographer, and he started producing these rayographs, these things where he would lay things right down on the photographic plate to create these bizarre or surreal images. He would also do things like take pictures like this. This is a take on Ong's Bather. He put these F-holes, silhouettes, to create the figure. And so we see photography changing as well. We see a whole series of incredible experiments that are produced. Perhaps one of the most amazing is the Ballet Mechanic, which was directed by Fernand Léger in collaboration with a whole bunch of others. The cinematography was done by Man Ray. Filmmaker was Dudley Murphy, etc. And this thing is just a trip. So the first time that film had been used as an expressive art form, the first time that we had performance, the first time we'd had incorporation of pop art, the first time, like popular material, printed materials, using collage or appropriation or ready-mades, all of these ideas come fundamentally out of Dada. And if it weren't for Dada, we wouldn't have had either the conceptual art movements or the performance movements or the pop art movements of the 1960s and 70s. So that's why Dadaism is important. Dadaism is fundamentally very short-lived. By the mid-20s, it's done. And people move on into other directions. They start going back to abstraction. They start picking up on the threads of abstraction, saying, okay, well, this is the way forward. If you're going to make an art based on aesthetics, it has to be based on something real and sincere, and so that's the direction they're going to go. Other people say, no, art is fundamentally not about technique or form, it's about meaning. And you have a split off of the Dadaist movement, which becomes surrealism. And these become the two essential modes of art between the war. That you have one camp that says, no, it's fundamentally about the message and what the message of the art is, and we need to find new vocabulary, new dreamlike imagery to create those messages, and that's the surrealists. And then others are like, no, it's fundamentally about abstraction and technique. And interestingly enough, both of these groups kind of meet in surrealism in the middle, in the space between the wars. But we'll save that for next time. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.